We're going to move the discussion on to immigration, an easy, mild, friendly topic to discuss these days. And take a look at the clip mentioned
Tell me, how much
earlier.
time do you need to sell your house and all your household goods?
Why should I sell my house? Is it in anybody's way?
I came here to tell you that you are going to have to leave Anatevka.
And how did I come to deserve such an honor?
Not just you, of course, but all of you.
So the constable tells Tevye that he's going to have to leave his home. Let's get into the topic of immigration just a little bit. A lawyer has an obligation to uphold the law. So the question is, when you have ICE, do you cooperate with ICE? Do you not cooperate with ICE? Is this an individual decision based on one's own morals or values? Does a firm make a determination of, we will cooperate, we won't cooperate? The judge mentioned judges in different parts of the country. Does everyone, every law firm in the country decide for themselves, we will, we won't? What are the moral issues we deal with on this? Larry, start us off here, please.
Thanks. So that's a really interesting clip. And it's a really interesting clip because as bad as the news is that the constable is delivering, look what he's doing. He's engaging in a little bit of an act of civil disobedience. And throughout Fiddler, he does this. He warns Tevye when the little pogrom is going to come so that they can prepare for it. And he doesn't allow him to actually be evicted forcibly. He gives him a little bit of a heads up. And it's just an interesting aspect of sort of being of the play that there's always an ambiguity in a way as to who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. I mean, Tevye in some ways is such a good guy. You want to root for him the whole time, but he's so mean when he won't embrace his daughter who marries outside the faith. The ambiguity of who's the good guy and who's the bad guy is always what makes life interesting, and literature and plays for sure interesting. But to, so now that I've treaded water for a little while trying to figure out the answer to the rabbi's question, look, I mean, our job as lawyers is not to cooperate with ICE. I mean, I represent individuals who are facing imminent deportation, who are facing detention as a result of sometimes justly, sometimes unjustly, as a result of their immigration status. My job is to fight for their rights to be heard, for the rights to have the opportunity to argue that they should be able to stay in this great country. My job is not to turn them over to ICE. And my job, as a general matter, what I do for a living is to oppose what I view as unjust government action or government action that would just be adverse to my clients. I don't confront that issue ever, day in and day out. And let me just say, if somehow there was deemed to be some responsibility for me to report my neighbor or my coworker to ICE, I'm not doing it.
Let me give you an example. Let's up the ante just a little bit. You represent a client who's being sued, and your client says, the person suing me is illegal, and I'd like to turn them in to help my case.
Well,
what would you do then?
So, there's ethical restrictions on all of this. So, for example, I'm not allowed as a lawyer to threaten some sort of criminal action in order to advance a civil end. That's something I can't do. I'm not allowed to do it. It would be unethical. I believe myself to be bound by those ethical restrictions. And I think
what would you advise your client?
I would not advise my client that he should turn. It depends on his case. I mean, you'd have to be a little more specific, right? I'm not sure it necessarily advantages his case to invoke some sort of immigration restriction against his adversary. And even if it was, there's morality that gets involved here, and I'm not sure it would be the moral thing to do. I'm not going to be in the business of advising my clients to do that which I believe is unlawful, unethical, or immoral. And if that means that there's some advice that I could give them that will advantage their case, then I shouldn't be taking that case. That's just not, and that goes back to what I said before. Let's all be honest. There are cases that we have that we believe in more than other cases. And if we can't do our job, if it's a case that we don't believe in enough, that's not a client we should take. As Chris pointed out, we don't have to take every single case. I actually am not troubled by representing a child pornographer necessarily, but I am troubled by representing somebody who's going to do something in the future as part of this litigation that is, to my mind, immoral and unethical. I won't do it.
Chris, help me out over here. Cooperate with ICE, not cooperate with ICE. You have a firm full of attorneys. They turn for guidance. What do we do here?
Well, this part of it, as Larry said, is really straightforward. I think, the advice in your example to the client is, I'm not giving you that advice. It's just not. It's not a game we're going to play. It's an ethical violation, and to start down that road in any way, shape, or form is a real mistake. And the truth is, it's probably a terrible strategy anyway. But it's not something that any of us are going to get involved in ever. It's as simple as that. It's easy. I mean, the interesting thing is this issue is sort of playing out. I forget if it's Ocean or Monmouth County. That's now filed a lawsuit challenging the Attorney General's directive that purports to and does direct county law enforcement about what it can or should or advise the Attorney General about in respect of its cooperation with ICE. I mean, there the issue is being joined. And I don't know which court has that case at the moment, who's the lucky judge who's got it, but it's going to be very interesting to watch that play out.
Judge Wecker, you want to jump in here?
What strikes me is that everyone's comments suggest a difference between one's own personal concern about the final outcome of whatever case it is, as opposed to what the law seems to require. And the imperfect analogy to the ICE hypothetical is that for a long time it's been a rule that a judge who finds out from a hearing, from evidence before the court, that someone has been failing to report income, for example, to the IRS, or has been taking deductions, the old, what has come to be known as the Leona Helmsley problem, has an obligation to report that. Now, if you're sitting there as a judge, putting aside if you represent one of the parties, on the one hand, you're supposed to report that. But suppose you're a family court judge who knows that by reporting it, you're going to damage the children of that family who won't have money for college. I'm being a little bit broad brush about that, but I think it's a real problem. It's just not as simple an answer as any of us would like to give, considering the ultimate outcome versus what seems to be, in theory, the right or wrong thing to do.
Rabbi, so Jewish law has a concept of dina de malchus adina, the law of the land is a law we must follow. There are people living all over the world in just environments and unjust environments, good laws, bad laws. How does one balance the moral obligation to be a light unto the nations and to be a moral and an ethical compass versus following the laws of the land, which may or may not be just and fair?
How does one balance? With great difficulty. I wish I had a magic formula. I have to say that as maybe the only person here who hasn't sat on as a judge on the bench, I am somewhat confused about the implication that there are times when it's appropriate for individuals, for localities to say, we don't like this law and we're just not going to practice it. That seems to me to be very fraught and something that undermines the entire legal system. Now, there are times when laws have to be disobeyed, but in Jewish law, it's pretty clear when that is true and when it's not true. At Nuremberg, we basically decided to prosecute people for laws that didn't exist because we assumed that there was an overarching law that somehow was available to all people that they should understand. And there are things that we understand have to be wrong, and if law tells us the opposite, then they can't be followed. But there are very few things like that. When it comes to things like immigration, we may feel as human beings and as Jews that we have to get up and we have to scream and we have to yell and we have to work to change the law. But that doesn't mean that we can arrogate to ourselves as individuals the right to disregard the law. That would seem to destabilize society in general.
Yep, I don't think.
But if
I don't think that's what any of us is saying. I mean, obviously, if there are rules, let's say, for example, there were a rule that if there were a whistleblower, that his complaint had to be turned over to Congress within a week. Let's just say hypothetically, those rules have to be obeyed. We are a society of laws, and no matter who you are, you should not be above them. And if there's a law that says that, if there were a law that said that if I come across somebody who was an unlawful immigrant, I was required to turn them over to the authorities, I would have to do that. That is the law. I have to obey it. There are ethical rules we have to obey. Nobody is saying anything other than that. The hypothetical we were given was whether we could use a negative fact about immigration in an effort to further our clients' interests. And I think both Chris and I agree that that is not something that we would feel comfortable doing or would do. This remains a country, as Justice Alvin said, of immigrants. My grandfather, my Zadie, Aaron Holtzman, came here from Russia in 1903, in exactly that time period between 1880 and 1920. It's why I'm here. It's why so many of us are here. So immigration is something that's near and dear to us. But the law is the law. The rules are the rules, and no matter who you are, you have to obey them. And the question here is, in discretionary situations, can you invoke a rule in an effort to gain an advantage in litigation? And that's what I reject.
Chris.
I actually think it's, it's simpler in that we're advocates. They come to us after they broke the law or after they arguably broke the law. And it's our job to convince somebody that they didn't, or if they did, that they should be treated fairly. It's not our job to enforce the law. It's a lot more complicated when it is your job to enforce the law. Believe me, it's much more complicated when the law says X and you don't want to do X.
Is this something you may have
I'm just saying
theoretically
hypothetically.
struggled with, hypothetically?
That's much more difficult. The quandary a judge faces, and Judge Wecker's example of, criminal conduct coming to light during the course of a legal proceeding, that's the job, is to enforce the law and to follow the law. We have the great luxury of arguing to change the law doesn't apply here, the facts are different, etc. We don't find ourselves in that predicament, where I think in law enforcement, you do.
And this constable here could just say, I was following orders, this was the law, and I'm just following orders, and that's that?
Well, that gets us back to, I don't want to overemphasize the history of the Holocaust, but
Just following orders.
That's the kind of bad karma we get from looking back at that so many people, including judges, just said they were following the rules. How bad do the rules have to be before you would say, Mr. Lusberg, no, I don't have to follow that?
Rabbi, at the Simon Wiesenthal Center, is just following orders an excuse?
Just following.
It was the law. I was following the law.
I revert to what I said before, that there are
I'm a
certain,
great guy.
There are certain laws. I hate to invoke the term because it's very much out of vogue, but really what happened in Nuremberg was an appeal to what centuries before had been called natural law. And I don't think anybody called it natural law at the time, but it really was an argument in natural law that there's some things that are just so basic to who we are as human beings and what human civilization is about, that ignorance of the law or obeying the law is no excuse. But there are very few things like that. There are very few things like that. I'm hard-pressed to find another example that comes close to what went on in the Holocaust, and the defendants who universally said, I was just obeying orders. There are very few crimes, if any, that rise to that.
Judge, last point, then we move on.
Yeah, one example, I think, is the regret that many judges have over having enforced the three strikes laws in various states, and having put people in jail that, when we look back, we were following the rules, and we now know that the outcome in many cases was very unjust, and it's
It's a
very
very
painful.
relevant point, which is why criminal justice reform is so important. It's such a big topic. Last point, Chris, then we move on.
I would just mention the one example that comes to mind as we talk about this, that we worked to try and create discretion when I was in government so that prosecutors could decide whether to actually prosecute low-level drug offenses. That seems like a really good thing. I personally thought it was a good thing, and I thought we should have done more of it. But it gets dicey when you leave the discretion up to somebody who doesn't have clear guidelines to follow. Is that person making a decision based on, well, I don't want to put this young individual into the system, into the criminal justice system, so that it's going to be harder for he or she to get a job down the road? Or is that person making decisions for other reasons? And it's very, very hard to police and enforce.
And in most cases, to Judge Wecker's point before, anytime you're sentencing someone to prison, in most cases, you're hurting their children. There are very few cases where you say the children will benefit from this, and how much of that should be a factor in the greater decisions that we're making.